The following podcast contains accounts of child sexual assault. Listener discretion is advised.
Okay, now did you know Frank Arkell prior to this?
I knew of him.
Well, what did you know of him?
I knew that he was a convicted pedophile.
And what made you decide to go to his house that afternoon?
I had in my mind that I wanted to kill him because didn't like him. So.
That's an excerpt from a police interview with 19-year-old Mark Valera, in which he confesses to the murder of former Wollongong Mayor Frank Arkell. Arkell had never been convicted of child sex crimes because Valera killed him before the charges made it to court. It was a sordid end to the two lives of Frank Arkell. Publicly, he was Mr. Wollongong, a popular politician, single-minded in his love of the city. At the time of his death, though, Arkell's private life had been exposed, along with a sophisticated pedophile network that infiltrated the highest echelons of his beloved city. Academic Erik Eklund, himself a Wollongong boy, has written the definitive biography of Frank Arkell. It's called Politics, Pride and Perversion: The Rise and Fall of Frank Arkell, and he joins us on Australian True Crime to talk about it. This is Australian True Crime. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this podcast is created, the Wurundjeri Woi Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation.
Frank Arkell was a very successful politician. He wasn't a member of any political party. He was an independent. And through incredible amounts of energy and community organising and profile work, he gained a reputation in Wollongong. He was elected to Wollongong City Council in 1965. He was very ambitious. He became Deputy Mayor in 1970 and eventually he became Lord Mayor in 1974. And he stayed Lord Mayor until 1991. So it was a long tenure. Over this period when, Wollongong's growing and changing, it's transitioning from a industrial and coal mining base to a sort of a post-industrial city. So he's quite an important figure. But not only did he win out at the municipal level, he actually beat the Labor Party, which was a very powerful force in the Wollongong area, to become the state member for Wollongong, 1984, and he won again in 1988. So he's a fascinating figure because he garnered this remarkable general popularity well beyond his ward, and he worked with the local media very effectively to create this sort of persona of Mr. Wollongong.
Mr. Wollongong. And he just talked constantly, consistently, at every opportunity about loving Wollongong, didn't he?
That's right. And it was a very simple message. And he was incredibly focused as a politician, disciplined and on message, I guess you'd say. In contemporary terms, he kept the message very straightforward and simple, and that is, look, Wollongong, we've been a little bit overlooked, but now I'm here and things are going to be different.
I do honestly feel that Wollongong is the second city of New South Wales. It's developing very fast. I feel we can work within council if we place the city above politics, above personalities, and work for the good of Wollongong. I think that we can get together, unite and go forward for the betterment of Wollongong.
And it was always a very sort of generic kind of message. There wasn't too much specific to it, but it appealed to people's loyalty and their sort of hopes for the future. These were difficult times. There was a couple of recessions in the early 70s and again in the early 80s. So this was an appealing message.
Yeah, he was able to convince the electorate that better times were around the corner at all times, wasn't he?
Yeah, exactly. And particularly in that earlier period, say the late 70s through to the mid-80s, that sort of message about more development, commercial growth in the Wollongong CBD, about new hotels coming to Wollongong, rebranding Wollongong as the leisure coast. He was also very much about stopping what he called escape spending. So these were people in Wollongong that were travelling up to Sydney and buying clothes and other things in the shopping centres of southern Sydney. He wanted to change that, and it would be like a consumer-led revolution in Wollongong where we'd all be shopping locally and there'd be prosperity sort of flowing forth. And there was that sort of populist element to it that, it was almost a relentless barrage of positivity. Even when he was subject to critical questions, he often just ignored them and just delivered his message. And for the community of Wollongong, there was a kind of a sense that maybe there was something going on with Frank Arkell. There was just a generic sense that Frank was a little bit different and that he may have preferred young boys.
He was middle-aged by this stage. He was never married, never had a public relationship. So these are the kinds of things that people kind of joke about, aren't they? Even in those days, the possibility of underage people being involved was joked about. And I can understand, though, that his public persona just kind of outweighed anything. As you said, it's almost Trumpy, the way it's just keep talking, don't give anyone a chance to get in there or grasp onto anything.
Yes, yeah, exactly. But his popularity, the fact that he was involved in multiple community groups, all of the service clubs, he'd turn up at people's 21sts, at all of the multicultural clubs in Wollongong, AGA Club, Germania, the Polish Club, the Hellenic Club. Every night of the week he would go to 2 or 3 events and he would shake the hand of everyone there. And so in the face of that, I think it was difficult for those sort of rumours and concerns to crystallise into anything more substantive. And, I've spoken to a lot of the journalists who reported on civic affairs during this period with the Illawarra Mercury and the local ABC radio station. And, they were just getting incredibly bored because Frank would turn up and pretty much say the same thing. He didn't really say anything different. He didn't really reflect on his life, or he didn't add any tidbits from his personal experience into his speeches. They were all more or less along the same line. So in the face of that, I think it was hard for them to get a sense of the man. Many found him occasionally charming, but they found it difficult to gain a sense of who exactly he was.
So now we know, and now I know because of your excellent research, that behind the scenes, his private life was a life that he very much wanted to keep private. Let's start with Tony Bevan, who was an associate of his.
Yeah, so Tony Bevan was a Wollongong businessman, and he'd also been on Wollongong Council, and he had a short term as mayor from 1965 to 1968, a fairly uneventful term. Not much happened. Bevan also was a property developer and a real estate agent, and Frank had family businesses in those areas. And Tony Bevan also ran a volunteer coastal patrol surveillance operation, rescuing people, warning people about sharks off the beaches and so on.
Oh, that's right, because he was a pilot, wasn't he?
He was a pilot. So he had this whole sort of volunteer profile, and, he was seen to be a tough businessman, but everyone loved him because, he was giving so much back. But what we learned through the Wood Royal Commission, 1996, 1997 in New South Wales, a commission into police corruption, was extensive evidence that Tony Bevan was really at the centre of a Wollongong-based pedophile network. Bevan was soliciting boys from Sydney, from Wollongong. They were receiving kids from places like the Philippines as well. So there was like an international trade. There were links up into Queensland, kids being brought back and forth from Queensland, from the Gold Coast to Wollongong, from Wollongong to the Gold Coast. And Tony ran this operation.
He was trafficking children.
He was trafficking children and generating pornography as well, and circulating that to the west coast of the US. And again, like Arkell, there was a kind of a concern about Tony locally. the people that I spoke to who were, teenagers in the 70s, some of them had a sense that Tony Bevan was a guy you had to keep away from, and his associates. So it's almost like it was sort of like an open secret that this stuff was going on, and that boys were being dragged into this world, and bad things were happening.
And along with the making of pornography, of child exploitation material, he was implementing something that we sort of are very wary of today with online predators, and that is that he was using that to blackmail the young people, wasn't he? Threaten them.
Yeah. So Tony kept extensive sort of recordings of all of his dealings. They might have been photographs, they might have been Betamax or 8mm film. Both his dealings with underage boys and young men, but also all of his business dealings as well. So there's sort of the characteristic manoeuvre of those who run these pedophile rings, so I understand, is to record all this material so that you can create a leverage on people, both for the boys that were involved, so that if they threaten to go to the police or whatever, then this material, you could threaten to release it. But also for the men who are involved, you could hold this over them to also secure their silence. So it was an illegal operation which worked, for a time at least, worked very effectively to suppress all capacity to speak about it or to report it or to tell someone in authority that this was going on.
And he was making money out of it too, wasn't he?
Yes, he was.
Not just with the pornographic material, but also he was charging men.
He was charging men, to meet up with boys in hotels in Potts Point in Sydney, in various apartments and flats that he may have owned or rented in Wollongong. So in that sense, being a real estate agent allowed him the opportunity to, find a venue to carry out these kind of practices.
What were the parties you described? Were they called royal parties or something that Bevan used to put on in Sydney?
Yeah, so they would head up to Sydney and go out to Costello's nightclub in King's Cross. And Costello's had sections upstairs which were like sealed off where men could go and have sex with boys. Typically they would pay Tony. And so a royal party would be what Bevan called a sort of an entourage that would head up to Sydney. Sometimes they'd take boys from Wollongong, and there were a couple of kids that were 14, 15 that were set up in an apartment owned by Tony. And other times they would pick up boys in Sydney, either at the Wall, at the Cross, or through other connections and contacts. So Tony was quite obsessed with the idea of bringing in new boys. And, so he was always on the lookout, including boys from the Philippines. So there's sort of international dimensions as well to the network.
Unbelievable. It's the Costello's nightclub story, I think, that shocked me the most, that there is an actual public business in Sydney that is being run like a brothel for underage boys. So given your research, how far back do you think Frank Arkell's involvement with this network went?
Yeah, it's a really difficult question to answer, precisely because the network was secret and illegal, so they suppressed all knowledge and information about it. The final charges of child sexual abuse that were levied against Frank in February 1997 covered incidents between 1973 through to 1984. But it's true, Meshel, that, pedophiles don't just arrive, at a certain age. It's not like, you turn 40 and you suddenly, develop this predilection to abuse young boys. So there may have been decades of abuse leading up to that. And I think the Bevan network dates at least from the late 50s. There's evidence of Bevan grooming boys by taking them up in his Cessna aeroplane from 1958, 1959. We do know that Arkell was an associate of Bevan. They had a complex relationship, but we do have evidence that Arkell turned up at various events and assignations that were organised by Tony Bevan. So I think the best estimate is a reasonable proposition is that we know for sure it dates from 73, but more than likely it's dating from the late 50s.
Yeah, and also, as you've said, people don't just become pedophiles one day. And also, a network like this doesn't evolve in a day, does it? I mean, the confidence with which Bevan ran this network and other men participated in it suggests that must have been a build-up of trying and succeeding for long enough to get to this level of confidence.
Yeah. So just about all the men involved that I can track were all very successful men in business, in politics. They could be outwardly charming. They could get their way. They were successful socially. It's not like the Wollongong Pedophile Network were sort of hiding in the shadows. Quite the opposite. They were controlling and infiltrating all the different organisations in local society, and it's a brazen bid for control. It's really quite incredible. The best form of maintaining a secret, apparently, was to control the very organisations that might have otherwise, blown the lid on the whole affair.
Who do you mean by that? Do you mean police? Do you mean media?
Probably the media come out the best in the bunch. They do very well once they finally get onto the story, but it's Wollongong Council in particular, and it's the local police, the Wollongong and Dapto police commands, and also I think it's the University of Wollongong as well that should have been able to turn a critical eye to regional society, to what was going on, but it was also apparent that there were a number of key individuals who were in the Pedophile Network that were also very active in the university. So all of those organisations that we hope might have some sort of fierce independence were arguably compromised by that.
Well, speaking of compromise, and obviously we don't want to suggest that every person who is victimised sexually as a child goes on to become a perpetrator, but there is evidence of a lot of child exploitation going on in the area before this, isn't there? And at the school that both Frank Arkell and Tony Bevan attended.
Yeah, so there's a crossover, Meshel, between the Pedophile Network and Tony Bevan and Frank Arkell and the local Catholic clergy and the local school, Catholic boys' school in Wollongong, that eventually renames and becomes Edmund Rice College from the mid-1960s. And there's pretty extensive evidence that a number of brothers who are involved in teaching at the school, along with a number of other Catholic priests throughout the region, were also involved in these child abuse practices, particularly focused on boys. So there's a crossover there. Frank was from a devout Catholic family. Many of his friends and relatives were Catholics, and likewise Tony was from a Catholic family. They both went to the Catholic boys' school. And so there's a close kind of match-up between what they may have experienced at school. I found no evidence of that. I found no sort of smoking gun.
But you have found evidence of specific predators at the school during the time they were there.
Yes. So many of their peers that they went to school with and many of the brothers that taught them ended up being charged with child sexual abuse. So there's a close relationship there between the sort of general milieu in which they are educated and where they end up as adults. And as you say, Meshel, plenty of kids went through those schools and didn't end up like that. Some of whom I've interviewed and were incredibly shocked by the findings, partly because to most people in Wollongong, Frank was a political personality. He was a character. They may have had some personal dealings with him. They may have had some interaction with him, but it was often of a normal variety. And so this is another way in which, the predators can sort of offset any suspicion, because if you have one problematic interaction, it's sort of overwhelmed by hundreds of other normal, everyday events. You're listening to people, taking their concerns seriously, being a good local citizen and volunteering, being a hard-working Lord Mayor. It certainly works to cover over some of those other anxieties.
There's also a sense of hiding in plain sight too, isn't there? Arkell, you have anecdotes in the book of people saying, yeah, I remember him organising tours of the council for young boys, like being at an event where he would just walk up to a group of teenage boys, ignore the adults, chat with these guys and talk about, oh, you should come and have a look at the council one day. And which I think if most people did that, it wouldn't seem strange, but in retrospect, it seems like he wasn't trying to hide it. You would think if you were involved in a pedophile ring in public, you would stay as far away from kids as possible. But also Tony Bevan, was volunteering in the surf lifesaving organisation, full of young men in bathers. It seems like they're sort of almost challenging people to accuse them of something.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I do have a theory, though, that I feel like probably from the early 80s, I feel like Arkell's behaviour becomes a bit more brazen. And there's an incident in the book where I've interviewed an old school friend. He was a friend of my brother's, Tony Tzolas. And Tony talked about going to HMAS Wollongong for the 150th anniversary celebrations of Wollongong's foundation. And they met up with Frank on the patrol boat in Port Kembla Harbour. And, they had a hoot of a time, but it was very clear that, as Tony recalls, Frank was after my ass. And they thought it was kind of funny, and then they invited him back to this party in Mount Ousley, a suburb of Wollongong, and Frank turns up in his Lord Mayor's car. He's chauffeured to the event, and there he proceeds to carry on and pursue Tony through the party and make it very clear, what he wanted. This is in the mid-80s, and that's very brazen behaviour. So my theory is that to some extent, Arkell, by this stage, it's like he feels as though he's protected. There's a couple of comments from a local journalist who believes that Arkell was given a warning by police, but other than that, we know that there's strong social relationships between some of the senior police, senior clergy and senior politicians in Wollongong. So my theory is that he kind of felt above the law to some extent in behaviour like that. There's some evidence he went cruising in some of the local cruising spots looking for young people to pick up. That's a man that doesn't really have a great concern about being picked up and about being questioned about his behaviour.
Yeah, it seems incredibly risky. Also, socially, it was a dangerous time for gay men. Gay men were being thrown off the cliffs in Sydney in those days.
Yeah, and the Arkell story intersects with the whole question about homosexual law reform through the 80s. And
which he opposed, didn't he?
Which he strongly opposed. So it wasn't as though, Arkell was in any way associated with or a spokesperson of the gay community. Until the day he was murdered, he vehemently denied that he was gay. He did not have any kind of characteristics of someone who was part of a community as such, and didn't identify as a gay man. But clearly, I felt like there was a way in which he sort of floated in and through that broader conversation around opening up society and equalising the law for men and women, for heterosexual and homosexual men and women, and such that it became kind of de rigueur from the mid-80s, for progressive people in particular, not to really, question people about their sexuality. That's kind of inappropriate. But I think Frank used that, and he used it as a very neat cover in a way that, perpetrators just take whatever they can from their environment and utilise it in a very effective way. So he publicly was vehemently against the whole question about the homosexual law reform, but in a way he benefited from it because, it was problematic to question someone that some of us maybe thought perhaps he was gay. We didn't know. But to really suggest that he was engaged in some sort of appropriate behaviour with children was equally problematic because there's this awful line that's run through the the 80s about gay men, being basically pedophiles.
Yeah.
So Frank, really worked that dilemma very effectively.
I think it's hard for us to remember now sometimes the environment. This is pre-Catholic Church's exposure to legal proceedings about this stuff. I grew up Catholic as well, so it would never have entered our minds that anything like that was happening with clergy. Let's speak about clergy. Let's talk about Michael Evans. It feels like there's sort of three men at the heart of this story, really. Obviously, Frank Arkell, it's his story. Tony Bevan, whom we've spoken about, who was running this pedophile network. Michael Evans, he was the principal of the school that they attended, wasn't he? And then by this stage, as adults, he was a friend of theirs.
Yeah, so principal of Edmund Rice College is it's a significant position in local society. You're really someone that a lot of people look up to. Principal of any school, but this was a large Catholic school, the biggest Catholic high school in Wollongong, and Brother Evans is the principal. And he, like some of the other individuals we've been talking about, was a very entrepreneurial man. He got engaged and involved in a whole lot of different social events. He was in the media. He wrote a column for the Illawarra Mercury focusing on youth concerns and youth issues. He was often on the radio. He was kind of seen as the approachable clergy, or the approachable Catholic-inspired educator. And so outwardly, he seemed like a incredibly kind, progressive and, fresh face of Catholic education in the 1980s. He was also involved with the police community consultative committee. So he had some relationships there with some of the senior police in Wollongong. And we do have evidence that Evans and Arkell were close. Frank was interested in spirituality. He was interested in the Catholic faith, obviously, and he was a reflective Catholic. He liked to think about his faith, and he liked to discuss the best ways to honour and serve God. To him, Brother Michael Evans was like the epitome of the best kind of Catholic. He was very civic-minded. He was progressive and out there spreading the Catholic faith, in particular to youth. And Arkell would often say that he felt like all of Christian faith, Anglican, Catholic and others, should be much more engaged with youth. So outwardly they shared a lot of common views, and it seems pretty clear that they were also pretty close.
If you'd like to talk to someone about abuse that's taken place in your life, no matter how long ago it happened, your GP is always a good place to start. If that's not going to work for you, you can contact 1800-RESPECT on 1800 737 732 or via their website 1800respect.org.au. Or you can call Lifeline's 24-hour phone counselling service on 13 11 14.
So I didn't find any evidence of an intimate relationship, an ongoing intimate relationship with Frank. A couple of people contacted me on condition of anonymity and, said some things. And there's some other sort of stronger claims that I didn't go to print on because I wasn't able to offer sort of reasonable confirmation. I feel like the book might unleash some other stories. And in fact, it sort of has done. I've, had a few phone calls since publication of people that have said, now this story's out, I feel like I can tell you a bit more.
Yeah, and I wonder how it links up to other stories I've heard too. We've spoken to people here who were in a government-accredited youth shelter in Sydney. I think it was in Surrey Hills. It was actually run by two pedophiles, and they ran a network out of there similar to what Tony Bevan was doing. And when you talk about his group of men travelling to Sydney for parties and visiting a boy brothel and things, I think, gosh, I bet this all links up. I bet these are connected.
Yeah, I think it probably does, Meshel. There's a couple of different targets for the Pedophile Network, and one is the sort of disaffected homeless kids that are kind of vulnerable. And the clergy in Wollongong set up Eddie's Place, which is like a youth refuge. And Brother Evans is involved there, as are some of the other clergy. It's pretty clear that there were state wards trafficked down to Wollongong. And I interview one for the book, and that's Ray Leary. And Ray has published a wonderful memoir, very challenging read, but a very brave book around his experience of being in and out of these state institutions. And he was actually trafficked by his social worker to Wollongong to a Bevan-inspired meeting a number of times over the summer of 1974. So I think there are connections that circle in and around Frank's biography and Frank's life story. The difficulty for researchers is to find sort of definitive evidence. And, one of the things that Ray said to me was that, look, there are no eyewitnesses to what I went through because all my friends are dead.
Mm.
And, I'm just a humble historian. And for the most part, the stuff that I deal with is in the archives. And when you talk to people that are eyewitnesses, that this represents their personal history, it's very humbling, and it's a very personally challenging thing to go through.
And we learnt through the Royal Commission, didn't we, that the effects of this kind of abuse during childhood, often in adulthood, are things like early death, suicide, drug and alcohol abuse, criminal lifestyle, and also all of that makes finding witnesses, and in the legal system, finding credible witnesses, really difficult. As far as Brother Evans goes, he was actually interviewed by police at one point, wasn't he?
Yeah, so there's a series of individuals that are interviewed and then subpoenaed by investigators who are working with the Royal Commission. And Evans is one of them. After there's concerns expressed locally in Wollongong, they eventually get onto the desk of Illawarra Mercury editor Peter Cullen, partly through a local journalist by the name of Brett Martin. And Brett was involved in the Vikings Rugby Union Club, and a number of kids that were coming through that club, young men by this stage, were saying, look, if Brother Evans has anything to do with this club, we're leaving. And then the Mercury starts pursuing these investigations and finds 3 victim survivors, and then starts asking the police, well, look, what have you done about this? You actually had 3 statutory declarations, 3 witness statements. This blows up in the Mercury. It's a front page story on the Illawarra Mercury. And then Evans is interviewed by investigators from the Wood Royal Commission, and the following day he commits suicide by gassing himself in his motor vehicle.
Suicide is an extraordinary reaction to being interviewed by police, and particularly for a Catholic, and more particularly for a priest. I mean, it's a mortal sin.
Yeah.
That's a massive reaction.
That's a huge reaction, and he's not the only one either.
There's a lot of suicides in your book.
There's a lot of suicides, yeah. That's very true, Meshel. Brian Tobin, who was a political associate of Arkell's and also a graduate of the Catholic high school, commit suicide after being investigated by Wood Royal Commission. A man called Peter Ferretic, who was involved in the Pedophile Network and was kind of like a partner of Tony Bevan. He drives out to the central west of New South Wales, and he also gasses himself in his vehicle after being served with the subpoena notice, which they find in his top pocket.
Well, his story is a big part of the story too, isn't it? Because he is able to demonstrate, I believe through his own testimony, that he was initially groomed and then he sort of joined the pedophile ring. And he talks about that process of the older boys being used to groom the younger boys, and like it gives you an idea of the scope of this thing and the structure of it.
Yeah. So the networks did use older boys to do exactly that, Meshel, to gain confidence of young boys. And Bevan liked boys about 14 or 15, and he had a particular type that he was always kind of looking for. And often to form a bridge to those kind of kids, they would use someone in their late teens or early 20s. So Peter Ferretic initially goes down to the Windang Aerodrome and he wants to learn how to fly. And he says in a very matter-of-fact way, I wanted to learn how to fly. I was 17 and Tony liked me and we traded sex for flying lessons. And then Ferretic stays around and becomes this person that works for the network in introducing boys. He always denied any involvement. He said, "Oh yes, look, I after Tony died of cancer in 1991, he talked to the local media eventually, and he said, "Oh look, I knew that Tony liked young boys, but I don't know anything about a pedophile network." And I think it's pretty clear too that Peter Ferretic probably destroyed a lot of the evidence in Tony's office. He had an office, his real estate office in Crown Street in the main street of Wollongong. Decades of photographs and 8mm and Betamax video, and all that's destroyed by Ferretic and possibly incriminating evidence of his involvement as well. So he always denied that he was in any way, shape or form part of the pedophile network.
But that's often a function of these networks too, isn't it, to incriminate the boys, if possible, so that it gets to a point where you're not going to tell anyone as an adult or at any point because you've also offended. I turned you into an offender.
Yeah, exactly. And there's some very poignant cases of boys, subsequently young men, going to the police and saying, "Look, I was abused by some of these men." And in those cases, defence attorneys and lawyers basically using the sort of subsequent criminal history of those victim survivors against them and saying, "Look, we're going to discredit your evidence because you subsequently were involved in other offences," which is a very typical trajectory for someone that's been abused as a teenager. Things go off the rails. And in many cases, the police just say, "Look, we're not going to pursue this. Either we don't want to, or we think that the defence lawyers will discredit you because of your subsequent history."
So when does Frank Arkell, Mr. Wollongong, transition from this very powerful, popular, untouchable character into a person who is known in the community to be accused of child sex offences? How does that evolution take place?
It's a complex process. I think there are two things going on at the same time. One is a steady decline in his popularity, and this might be sort of electoral popularity, if you like. He's very busy. He's got 2 jobs. He's a state member and he's the Lord Mayor. He's really struggling under the weight of that. He gets increasingly impatient with people. He's known in the council as Cranky Frankie because he turns on people, and anyone who's not on the side of his sort of vision, he becomes a great hater. And that slowly filters out into the community, and you see some of his voting support begin to drop away. But I think what was maybe, concerns and whispers in the 70s and 80s sort of become almost like an avalanche of claims and counterclaims really after he loses office. So when he becomes a less powerful, influential individual after 1991, I think he gets mentioned in Parliament by Franco Arena and Deidre Gruzovan. There's a couple of claims made in the local media.
Well, Deidre blew it wide open, didn't she? Because she actually outed him as being part of an investigation in the Royal Commission, the Wood Royal Commission. And at that point, his name was suppressed and he was known as W1 in the Royal Commission. And then she walked into Parliament and outed him. And she said, W1 is none other than Frank Arkell.
In fact, that was Franco Arena.
Right.
Identified Frank Arkell as W1.
Mrs. Arena claimed that along with Justice David Yeldham, Mr. Arkell received preferential treatment by the Wood Royal Commission.
What about former MP Frank Arkell, known to the Commission as who was summoned and did not present himself as his lawyer said he was too ill.
And of course, there's a big furor in Macquarie Street in Sydney because someone in Parliament has gone against a suppression order of a Royal Commission, and there's lots of debate. There's constitutional and political debate about whether that was the right or the wrong thing to do. Both Deirdre Gruzovan and Franco Arena had received through their office a number of claims, allegations. Both of them said, look, the stakes were so high that we weren't concerned about the niceties of this. But I think that's the beginning of a kind of a public decline in Frank.
I bet.
Which, you see more and more allegations. You see the Illawarra Mercury start to publish stories, and as soon as the suppression order is lifted, the very next day, both the Mercury and the Sydney Morning Herald publish major allegations against Frank from witness statements given under oath to the Wood Royal Commission that are basically saying this guy is a pedophile. We've come across him in these networks.
3 witnesses at the Royal Commission claim to have had sex with Mr Arkell when they were aged between 13 and 15. But the former MP denied the paedophilia allegations.
It's a terrible thing, we call that. It's the worst thing in the world.
And then from there, his public life sort of slowly recedes. It sort of shrinks down from someone that had been everywhere in the 70s and 80s. Really by 1995, 96, he's a sad, sort of lonely figure. He shuffles along the streets around where he lives. He sits in the park. Some people think maybe he developed a form of dementia over this period. He's clearly buckling under the weight of this massive reversal of public standing.
Also, he's sort of left holding the bag a bit, isn't he? Tony Bevan's dead. Father Evans is dead. Brian Tobin is dead. So he's the most high profile, I would suggest, of people who are facing these allegations. He was eventually charged with 29 offences, right?
He was. In February 1997, a task force that was actually set up by the Wood Royal Commission, the Child Enforcement Protection Unit, turn up in his home in West Wollongong and take him down to Wollongong Station, and he's charged with 29 counts of child sexual abuse.
Why did he choose me? Why did he think it was right? Just why? Why did he do that?
It's a question that has haunted Renee for 13 years. He was 17 when he says he was drugged and raped by Frank Arkell.
Me going to the police and charging him wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about you did wrong by me, I'm going to do wrong by you. It was just a matter of, look, what you did was wrong, and you must know, you must admit to it.
At that stage, he's very much a lone figure. And I think you're right, Meshel, that a lot of his contemporaries have either died or they've killed themselves. And one of the limitations of the Wood Royal Commission was, in terms of exploring child sexual abuse, was that it was only interested in police corruption. So Commissioner Wood, at a number of moments, said, look, we may have evidence of child abuse going on here, but in this case, I can't see any evidence of police corruption. So, I'm actually not going to pursue that. And in the case of the King's Cross Police Command, he found systemic and widespread corruption into that command. And there's a critical line on the Wood Royal Commission which says that, it was easy to focus on Tony Bevan, for example, and there's a whole chapter on Tony Bevan and the Pedophile Network, and it is truly gruesome. But some would argue that there were more high-profile figures that were left out of the picture, and it was awful, but I think a little politically safer to focus on Bevan. And by this stage, Arkell's got no more political friends left. He's got no more political supporters. He's got no more political capital. And he becomes the guy that is the focus of the mid-90s anxiety around child sexual abuse.
And so as part of his charges, charges of sexual intercourse without consent at various locations, there are charges relating to drugging victims, I believe, sex without consent, with a stupefying drug.
Yes, it was just alcohol in that case, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
4 charges of buggery in Wollongong, unlawful administration. So there's a number of unlawful administrations of stupefying drug, being alcohol, before having sexual contact with underage boys, essentially, isn't there? That's the long and the short of it.
That's the long and the short of it. Look, from what we know about how these criminal networks operate, I think we can reasonably assume that that's the tip of the iceberg.
Now, in 1998, Arkell is living in his home. It was the home that he lived in with his mother for many years, but since her passing, he's lived there alone. He's lived there forever, knows the neighbours, they know him. And they are saying, yeah, we see him wandering around a bit. And a bloke across the road actually said, sometimes I wake up and he's in my backyard, gardening and what have you. So he's not doing well. But explain this to me. A young man called Mark Valera, by his own admission, just rang him up one day, rang Frank Arkell up and said, I'm a young homosexual, is what he reckons he said, essentially. Can I come over and talk to you? Now, how on earth, really, was Frank Arkell's phone number available? And what do you mean you can just ring Frank Arkell and say, can I come over?
Yeah, it's an interesting question how he got Frank's number. We've taken that from Valera's testimony at his trial, at his subsequent trial. But it's clear that they came in contact somehow and organised a meeting. It could have been that Valera got a phone number from a network colleague or a friend. It's hard to say. But by this stage, by June 1998, Frank is very isolated. He's lonely. He's clearly struggling mentally. And I've sort of speculated that he may well have sort of welcomed some sort of contact.
He definitely seems to have, doesn't he? Because he said, yeah, come over.
He said yes. So he got a call Friday morning and then went off to the garden shop, which he liked to visit a garden shop in Ferry Meadow, which is one of his favourite places, just a suburb of just north of Wollongong, and organised to meet Valera later that day.
What he didn't know was that Valera had 2 weeks prior brutally murdered a man called David O'Hearn.
Yes.
Mark Valera committed acts described today as evil and gruesome. When he developed the urge to kill, he chose at random the house of 59-year-old Wollongong newsagent David O'Hearn. Valera beat O'Hearn to death and mutilated his body.
It was a scene that I'd never encountered in all my years in the police. There was a body of a male laying on his back. He'd been decapitated. There was a hand sitting on a lounge, and it appeared that he'd been completely disemboweled, and the intestines and that were laying on a silver tray that was alongside the body.
On one of the walls there was a pentagram with the word Satan beside it. Another wall had an inverted cross.
A truly horrific crime. And I've spoken to some of the family members of David O'Hearn, and these things resonate through the generations, and my heart goes out to them. A quiet man who led a quiet life in the southern suburbs of Wollongong. Initially, the police came up with all kinds of theories. They were dealing with Arkell and O'Hearn's murders. They surmised that maybe both men were pedophiles.
Mm-hmm. And the media reported that, right, at the time?
The media reported that, much to the chagrin of the family, who were, deeply shocked and saddened by that. David O'Hearn was a man in the wrong place at the wrong time. He answered the door. Mark Valera just wanted to kill someone, and he started knocking on doors in the suburb where his grandfather lived. And sadly, David O'Hearn answered and said to Mark Valera, sure, look, come in. I understand you're looking for somewhere to live. I'll make some phone calls, and turned around and, then he was attacked and brutally, horrifically murdered by Valera. And by the time we get to Valera calling Arkell, he's itching to kill again. He's got this thing in his head that he has to do it again. And he tells police later on, once he'd surrendered to police, I read about Arkell in the papers and I just thought he was the next guy I was going to kill.
Yeah, because it turns out that Mark Valera said, and his sister backs him up on this, that he was abused by his father most of his life, sexually abused by his father. And so I guess, reading about this guy, this high-profile guy in the paper, set him off. I don't know if that was his excuse for the David O'Hearn murder, but we should make it very clear that there's absolutely no evidence whatsoever that David O'Hearn was involved in child exploitation or child sex crimes at all. He just happened to be gay, which seems, in retrospect, to be a coincidence, doesn't it? I mean, he seems to be a random victim.
He's a random victim. He's just an everyday person who happens to be gay. And one of the brutalities of this is that, sometimes our identities are irrelevant to what happens to us. Sometimes our sexual preferences don't determine what happens to us. It's just the random hand of tragedy, really.
And so when Valera enters the house and apparently attacks Frank really quickly, really soon after entering the house, doesn't he?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, he attacks Frank almost straight away. And much like David O'Hearn, he murders him in a brutal fashion. He defiles Frank's dead body. He sits down and then takes off his blood-spattered clothes. He puts on some old tracky pants that was in Frank's cupboard. And later that night, he leaves. It's a little granny flat at the back of where he lived with his mother. His mother lived in the house at the front in West Wollongong, and Arkell lived in like an apartment out the back. Arkell is murdered on the 26th of June, 1998, and Valera leaves that morning. So early morning on the 27th, Valera takes off.
Early this morning, police were called to a home in North Wollongong by an elderly friend of Frank Arkell. Inside a flat at the back of the house, they found the badly beaten body of the 67-year-old man. Mr. Arkell was last seen by neighbours yesterday afternoon outside his home. Today, police couldn't give the time of the murder. The attack comes just weeks after the decapitation murder of another Wollongong man, rumoured to be associated with a satanic cult. Police would not rule out a connection.
It is just too early to speculate at this stage. We'll be following a number of investigative lines of inquiries.
Really, for Wollongong, there's a sense that society's falling apart, that there's been two high-profile, really brutal murders within the space of 2 weeks. And Valera doesn't give himself up until the 1st of October, I think, from memory. So there's a 2 or 3 month period where everyone's on edge, where it's not really sure what's going on. Is there a serial killer? Is there some sort of network going on? Is there more than one perpetrator? The police are uncertain. They actually interview Valera as a possible suspect, but they don't charge him.
Well, they sort of went looking for his flatmate, didn't they, in the beginning? And the flatmate wasn't home. So they talked to Valera. I mean, so they were circling, they were close, but actually in the end Valera told his karate instructor or somebody like that, didn't he?
Correct, yeah. He told his karate instructor who, was understandably fearful for his own life, but sort of escorted him into Wollongong police station where he offered a full confession. The very next day he took detectives out to West Wollongong to Frank's little apartment and then took them through what he did and said and what happened and offered a full confession.
Yeah, I've seen those walkthroughs, as I'm sure have you, and they are, to use an overused word, chilling, because he's so matter-of-fact about it, isn't he? So open about it. He tells them lots of things that haven't been made public. He's really not guarded at all.
He turned his back to me. I rammed him into the wall.
And what's happened then? Once his head struck there, what's happened?
He fell to the ground and I gave him a few hard boots.
Yeah, right now.
What I grabbed next? Fucking hell. Pardon my language. I grabbed the cord and I put it around his neck. I was attached to a lamp and I just thrusted it down like that. Really.
How many times do you think you hit him?
40 plus times.
More than 40 times?
I had blood all over my face and on my hands, on my boots. I was swearing at myself. Got blood all over me effing pants.
He's not guarded and he has zero feeling for the suffering of others.
Yeah.
There's absolutely nothing in his demeanour, in his reflection, in his retelling that says anything about the gravity of taking two people's lives. It's really very chilling.
And so because of that, Frank Arkell never goes to court, never has his day in court, and is never able to defend himself against these charges. That's sort of where it sits, isn't it?
That's where it sits. So the 29 charges went to a committal hearing. So we do have a little bit of evidence on the committal hearing. And because the prosecutor in Wollongong was anxious about whether witnesses would seem credible, etc., those 29 charges whittled down to 5 charges involving 4 victim survivors. There were others circulating around, but the police, for various reasons, said, no, we're not going to touch that case. That was due to be heard in Parramatta Court in September 1998. So literally Mark Valera's murder of Frank Arkell is justice denied. Given the overwhelming evidence against Arkell, given that this is a handful of cases and what must have been close to a lifetime of offending, it's really difficult to take the notion that he is not guilty. He was never found guilty in a court. And, Valera's murder takes that away from us. There are still people that argue that Frank may have been found not guilty. We can never be certain. But for those people too, for the people that still supported him, likewise Valera takes away that chance for their sort of populist Mr. Wollongong hero to be cleared of all charges.
Was anybody convicted? Anybody from this pedophile ring in Wollongong?
No, they weren't. Frank was murdered. Wow. Tony Bevan had died in 1991 of cancer. Peter Ferretic had killed himself. Brian Tobin had killed himself. Brother Michael Evans had killed himself. The other high-profile businessman in the Wollongong network had passed away, which I think really goes to the fact that it had been operating for a while. If there's evidence that the network was organising assignations in the early 70s. A lot of these men are elderly by the 80s and the 90s. So the other names that we know have passed on. So no one out of the Wollongong pedophile network was found guilty of any charges.
My goodness. I feel like we can't stop talking about this story until we've mentioned Father Murray Crocker. What can you tell us about Father Crocker?
Father Crocker was the boxing priest from Berkeley, and Berkeley is a suburb just south of Wollongong. It's had lots of housing commission houses in the area. It's a bit of a struggle town, Berkeley. It's changed a lot these days. But Father Murray Crocker ran a boxing gym and engaged with a lot of young men and boys through the boxing ring itself. And through that process, he started to hear stories about some of the clergy in Wollongong, and he approached the head of the diocese and he approached Wollongong police. And on both occasions, it didn't come to anything. He was promised that one particular individual was receiving counselling, and the police said they would look into it. Now, the police did go ahead and take witness statements, but they didn't follow it up. Some of this we know because of the Wood Royal Commission. We know that New South Wales Special Branch sent a senior sergeant down to Wollongong in November 1990, and this senior sergeant wrote quite an extensive report on the Wollongong Pedophile Network, a cover note, and like a network chart of all the individuals and their names and their relationships. Now, according to police, the extensive report was lost or never filed, and only the cover note and a one-page network outline has ever been found. Subsequent to that was hoovered up by the Wood Royal Commission, so we can't even look at that now either, Meshel. Those records are locked away for 100 years. And Father Murray Crocker was clearly, very distressed by this, the fact that the church that he devoted his life to had not really followed up on these matters. He also had a close friend who committed suicide, and in the end, it was all too much for him, and he took his own life in the boxing gym in Berkeley.
Oh, it's heartbreaking.
It is heartbreaking, and the only sort of saving grace out of that story that I could find was that there were 700 people that turned up to Father Crocker's funeral, which was many more than the 300 who turned up for Frank Arkell's.
Thank you to today's guest, Erik Eklund, author of Politics, Pride and Perversion, The Rise and Fall of Frank Arkell, which is available now.
If you need support after listening to this podcast, you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or contact 1-800-RESPECT on 1-800-737 732 or 1800respect.org.au. Indigenous Australians can contact 13 Yarn on 13 92 76 or 13yarn.org.au.
The producers of this podcast recognise the traditional owners of the land on which it's recorded. They pay respect to the Aboriginal elders past, present and those emerging.